Noon in Washington, and Ronald Reagan becomes the 40th President of the United States.
So help me God.
35 minutes later in Tehran, Iranians finally release 52 American hostages after 14.5 months in captivity. We'll have reports.
From ABC, this is World News Tonight with Peter Jennings in Frankfurt, Max Robinson in Chicago, and from our desk in Washington, Frank Reynolds.
Good evening. Now, day one. Day one of Ronald Reagan's presidency, and day one of freedom for 52 Americans. Though thousands of miles apart, these two historic events moved almost on parallel tracks today. The new president had not been in office an hour when the former hostages became free men and women again. And they are well along now on their trip to West Germany and eventually to home. For the latest on their return to freedom, here is Peter Jennings in West Germany. Peter?
Frank, the Algerian 727 carrying the freed hostages left Athens about 1 hour ago. It's now over the Mediterranean. It was on the ground 90 minutes for refueling. No one disembarked. The American ambassador to Greece, Bob McCloskey, did not go on board, but he did send some flowers on board, and he got a note back from his old friend Bruce Langan, who said, "I am very glad to be finally going home." It is about a 3-hour flight from Athens to Algiers, where the former captives should arrive about 8:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We've seen only 2 pictures from Tehran itself today. Iranian television did not transmit any of its coverage outside the country. We have seen 2 still photos. In one, Joseph Subik Jr., the second from the left, is being escorted by 3 Iranians. Subik, whose parents live in Redford, Michigan, had once been specifically accused by his captors of being a spy. In the second picture, Donald Cook, he's the one with glasses and a beard and somewhat more familiar to us, is also being escorted. For Cook, at 25, Tehran was his first overseas post with the State Department. Well, the Iranians who watch television have seen more than we have. It's been on local television there, and in Tehran, the Australian reporter Ray Sinclair offers his impression of what he saw.
I think a lot of people at the other end are going to be quite shocked by what they see of the Americans who will get off that plane. Just looking at them, they appear to have, momentarily at least, lost complete touch with reality. I'm quite sure they cannot conceive that they are free now. Their faces are blank, their eyes are glazed. It's a stunning emotional experience.
One of the last people to see the Americans in person just before the plane left was the Swiss ambassador Eric Lang. 2 hostages, he said, had difficulty walking, but the others looked fit. They have aged, said the ambassador, and he referred specifically to the chargé d'affaires Bruce Langan, an old friend of his at Will. It was childlike, the ambassador said. The hostages, couldn't quite believe they were leaving, but they were falling all over each other with emotion. There was laughing, and there were tears. Many, perhaps most, had not seen each other for those 14 months. It was, said Ambassador Lang, a moment that will stay with me for the rest of my life. And so it is now Algiers where world attention will be focused. Without the Algerian government, this deal for the Americans' freedom would not have been made. And when the 52 stopped there, briefly, there are no plans for them to remain overnight. Algeria's role in all this should deservedly be restated. In Algiers, here's ABC's Luciaffi.
The 2 American Nightingales, which will carry the hostages on the next leg of their voyage, arrived here at Algiers airport tonight. These medical evacuation planes are designed to give emergency treatment until they reach a major medical facility, and they may be necessary. As ABC News has reported, some of the hostages are physically and mentally tired. 2 of them are said to be having difficulty walking. But tired or not, their arrival here is going to be the cause for celebration.
Even before the hostages arrived, the American negotiating team in Algiers held its own party, popping the corks in a couple of bottles of champagne to mark the end of a long, difficult, and often frustrating effort to get the Americans released. The mood of celebration was echoed by the head of the delegation, Deputy Secretary of State Warren Christopher.
Just say I'm very happy.
Once on the ground, the hostages will be taken to the VIP lounge at Algiers Airport for a short 1.5-hour stop to change planes. They'll be greeted by Algeria's foreign minister, who played an important role in the final drama. There may be an informal reception, but nothing elaborate. The Algerians understand the impatience of the hostages to waste no time continuing on their way. The next destination, West Germany, and an American military hospital. At Wiesbaden, the next to the last stop on their long trip home. Peter?
Lou, thank you very much. Perhaps I needn't remind you, but wherever the hostages are, and especially when they get here to West Germany, ABC News will be on the air. Frank?
Thank you, Peter. We certainly will be, and we'll be back to you, too, later in this broadcast. Well, before this day of happiness could dawn, there were more anxious hours during the long night. In this country, the command post, as often in a time of crisis, the Oval Office of the White House. We have a report from Barry Dunsmore.
It wasn't the first time that top Carter administration officials had spent sleepless nights in the Oval Office over Iran. But no matter what, it would be their last. This one had a different ending.
Mr. President, Secretary Miller.
All right, here we go.
Hello? Yeah, right on, man. That's great. That's great. Okay, now the next step then. So that'll go to Algiers, and Algiers, when they notify Iran, will notify us back, right?
Later this morning, after word was received that Iran had taken all the necessary steps to make the transfer of its assets possible, Mr. Carter could relax even more, although there was always the nagging doubt. It wasn't until the motorcade on their way to the capital that the president was able to tell the president-elect that the hostages were aboard planes and would be airborne in 15 or 20 minutes. But it would be longer. Finally, just before Mr. Carter got to Andrews Air Force Base for his trip home to planes, the hostages' departure was officially confirmed. They had taken off about a half an hour after he was no longer president. The timing could hardly have been accidental. Once the planes had left Iran's airspace, members of the Iran working group at the State Department could take their first sigh of relief and begin formally informing hostage families that everyone was out and safe. Relief, exhaustion, and disbelief were the prevailing emotions. Also at the State Department, Mrs. Louisa Kennedy, who had become a hostage family spokesman, said she was numb. She also described the Iranians' last-minute toying as revolting. Mrs. Catherine Keogh, whose husband was the schoolteacher who just happened to be in the embassy when it was taken, spoke eloquently of the emotions of the moment.
I think what you are looking at is about 15 months of holding one's emotions in check. And to shed all of that magically with a snap of the finger and say it's over is very difficult to do. We are experiencing a decompression as almost exactly the kind of decompression that the hostages must be going through.
Outgoing Secretary of State Muskie also had some thoughts on what the hostage crisis had meant to him.
Well, I suppose, in a sense, I'll be known in the footnotes of State Department history as the hostage secretary. I came in because of this problem, and because of it, I was not destined to continue, and they've come home at the end. I think it's perfect.
The State Department is nearly empty this evening. The Carter folks have left. The Reagan people haven't yet arrived. Many of the professionals don't know what they're going to be doing. Such circumstances don't really lend themselves to celebrations. However, there is an overwhelming sense of relief here that the new administration can begin without the curse of the Iran crisis. Barry Dunsmore, ABC News, the State Department.
Well, still ahead, the joyful reaction of the families of the freed Americans as they learn that this time it's true. We'll look at exactly what preparations are underway at the hospital in Wiesbaden, where the former hostages will spend the rest of the week, and we'll report on Ronald Reagan as he assumes the office of President of the United States.
ABC's World News Tonight, brought to you by Budweiser.
Now for the story of another beginning and an ending. The inauguration of the new president, the departure of his predecessor. But for both, a day of triumph. We have reports on each. First, White House correspondent Sam Donaldson.
When Ronald Reagan began his day by attending special services at St. John's Church on Lafayette Square, he was still a private citizen, but not for long. To the White House he drove to be met by the man he was replacing.
Well, I think the President-elect and his wife will enjoy the new home.
The Reagans and the Carters going in for a brief cup of coffee. Then up to the Capitol they went, the two men riding together in the same car, heading for the exchange of power. The ceremony was held for the first time before the west front of the Capitol instead of the east, looking down the mall to the Washington Monument and beyond. But even as the two men walked out on the special platform, the suspense over the hostages continued to hang over the moment.
Mr. President, are the hostages out?
Can't say yes.
Hang over, but not dominate. Only one event could truly dominate the ceremony at the Capitol on this day.
I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear
that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
That I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
And will, to the best of my ability.
And will, to the best of my ability.
Preserve, protect, and defend.
Preserve, protect, and defend.
The Constitution of the United States.
The Constitution of the United States.
So help you God.
So help me God.
May I congratulate you, sir.
Ronald Reagan was a private citizen no more, but spoke as the 40th President of the United States.
The business of our nation goes forward. These United States are confronted with an economic affliction of great proportions. We suffer from the longest and one of the worst sustained inflations in our national history. We must act today in order to preserve tomorrow. And let there be no misunderstanding. We are going to begin to act beginning today. Can we solve the problems confronting us? Well, the answer is an unequivocal and emphatic yes. To paraphrase Winston Churchill, I did not take the oath I've just taken with the intention of presiding over the dissolution of the world's strongest economy. And as we renew ourselves here in our own land, we will be seen as having greater strength throughout the world. We will again be the exemplar of freedom and a beacon of hope for those who do not now have freedom.
It was an inspirational address promising a new beginning. And in fact, while still at the Capitol, President Reagan signed an executive order freezing federal hiring in the executive branch. And at a luncheon, he could announce another new beginning.
Some 30 minutes ago, the planes bearing our prisoners left Iranian airspace and are now free of Iran.
The new president and his wife paraded down Pennsylvania Avenue, riding, not walking, waving to large enthusiastic crowds who had turned out to see him. And from the reviewing stand in front of the White House, he watched his parade. Late this afternoon, Ronald Reagan literally entered the Oval Office, the power and the prestige of the presidency his, also the burdens. Sam Donaldson, ABC News, the White House.
This is Barry Serra. It was a bittersweet moment as Jimmy Carter, private citizen, left Andrews Air Force Base outside of Washington to go home to Georgia. There had been affectionate goodbyes from aides and friends who saw him off. Later, there would be some tears among staff members who accompanied him on board Air Force One. When Mr. Carter arrived home in planes, he found a big crowd waiting in drizzling rain to welcome him, perhaps triple the normal population of this little Georgia town. Also there to greet him, his mother, Miss Lillian. The famous Carter smile flashed as the former president made his way through the well-wishers. But it had been a wrenching day for Mr. Carter. An aide said he had been terribly hurt and disappointed when he was not able to announce the release of the hostages before leaving office this morning. And speaking to old friends and neighbors here, he talked about his emotions. About, for example, a conversation with the wife of a hostage before leaving Washington.
Mrs. Schaefer, who is the wife of the senior military man being held by the hostages, said to me, Mr. President, I hope someday you'll have a chance to meet my husband. And I put my arms around it, and I said, I'll be with him tomorrow, and I'll tell him you love him.
Mr. Carter's emotion showed as he described how he finally got official word of the hostages' release just before he arrived in Georgia.
I had received word officially for the first time that the aircraft carrying the 52 American hostages had cleared Iranian airspace on the first leg of a journey home, and that every one of the 52 hostages was alive, was well, and free.
Mr. Carter will fly to Germany tomorrow to see the hostages.
But today, after so many months of disappointment, in a crisis that contributed to his leaving office, he was back home and finally had something to smile, even dance about. Barry Seraphin, ABC News, Plains, Georgia.
On Wall Street, the release of the hostages apparently had little effect, but there are some analysts who think there was disappointment over a lack of specifics in President Reagan's speech, and the market today was down more than 20 points. The final release of the hostages today, after 444 days of waiting, unleashed a wave of stored-up emotions. Communities across the nation, church bells and sirens rang out the news of their freedom, and in the homes of the families of the former hostages, there were toasts, hugs, kisses, and tears of relief. John Martin reports.
New York, at Times Square, thousands of light bulbs flashed the message. At a construction site on Madison Avenue, the hard hats who had been counting the days put up a sign. Thank God, it read, they're free at last, never again. At a cathedral, they began ringing the bells. And there were echoes all across the country. Meanwhile, the families of the hostages had been watching television, but waiting for the telephone. In Bellevue, Nebraska, Paul Needham's father answered a call from the State Department's Iran Working Group.
They are in the air.
In Oak Creek, Wisconsin, friends put up a poster thanking God for bringing Marine Guard Kevin Hermaning home. His mother, Barbara Tim, seemed overwhelmed.
I felt none of the joy or the jubilation that I felt the other night. I just felt total relief. Thank God. They're in the air. They're free.
Now they are free.
In Cudahy, Wisconsin, Richard Hermaning heard the word and knew his son and the country was finally free.
America is still prevailing in this whole thing because everybody cares and nobody's lost support for the hostages.
In San Diego, Dorothea Moorfield was cutting a cake for a throng of people in her home. She had become a leader, helping hostage families keep their nerve. Now it was over. In Pueblo, Colorado, Richard and Teresa Gallegos sipped champagne and answered telephone calls from their friends and cried and hugged.
Yes, everything's official and they're on their way home.
In Pasadena, California, the Reverend Earl Lee was quizzing the State Department.
Do you have any idea how long they've been off the ground?
And people were holding up a banner welcoming home his son Gary. The sign was a year old.
All right.
In Loop City, Nebraska, Marine Guard Michael Muller's parents and friends stood in a circle to pray.
We pray, Lord, for a safe trip for the hostages as they fly from Tehran to Algiers, from Algiers to Germany.
And in Detroit, a choir of children showed up outside the home of hostage Charles Jones's wife to serenade her.
Free at last, free at last, thank God Almighty, oh, free at last, free at last, free at last, thank God Almighty, oh, free at last.
All across America, there were tears and some anger at the final indignities of delay, but mostly relief as the children sang, "Free at last, thank God Almighty, free at last." John Martin, ABC News, New York.
It's been fashionable to say these last few days that here in Frankfurt and in next-door Wiesbaden, the U.S. military has not been on edge, that it's been ready for 14 months. Don't you believe it? The ups and downs of yesterday and today have been dramatically felt by the many thousands of Americans who live in the region. Out on the flight line at Rhein-Main Air Base, ABC's James Walker.
It wasn't the first effort here on behalf of the hostages. For the third time in as many days, Air Force crews at Rhein-Main Air Base prepared for flight the hospital planes that will bring the 52 Americans back here. As crew members carried on board copies of the U.S. military newspaper Stars and Stripes, they had no reason to believe that this would be the day they would leave to pick up their special passengers. Some Air Force people, acting as though they had a premonition of the good news to come, displayed their feelings, while others, whose job it is to take care of the hospital planes, carried a similar welcome, which they proudly raised for the hostages to see. Finally tonight, the departure everyone at this airbase has been working for. The flight to bring the hostages home had begun.
When they arrive here, there'll be no official welcoming ceremony. Instead, they'll just transfer to buses for a 40-minute ride to the U.S. Air Force Hospital in Wiesbaden. Peter?
James, we've been seeing signs go up and down for the last couple of days. What's the first thing you think that the former hostages will see when they get off those aircraft?
Perhaps, Peter, will be a sign right around the corner from where I'm standing that says, "You're halfway home, baby."
Thank you, Jim. It'll be a long but worthwhile night. I must say, for us in Frankfurt, those nightingales taking off into a night sky were a visual reinforcement of the news that the former hostages were on their way. Out at the Wiesbaden Hospital today, some visual evidence of how welcome they will be. 3rd and 4th grade American school children had made posters and written letters. They were simple but declarative. "We're so glad you're back. I hope you have a nice time in Wiesbaden. I like you here." Signed, Bobby. At the hospital itself, amid all the yellow ribbons, ABC's Bob Dyke.
This is the halfway point, the decompression center. Things are quiet here at the U.S. Air Force Hospital in Wiesbaden, West Germany at the moment. But it's just a matter of time before activity becomes intense. When 52 Americans come up the driveway here and enter the hospital, this will be their home for a few days. But they'll have plenty of Americana, physical examinations, psychiatric examinations, and debriefings, and I imagine that most of them are looking forward to those telephones which they can use to call their friends and loved ones at home.
Bob, we've often heard that women like to go to the telephones first, and men like to have showers before they do anything else. Any truth in that, as best you can tell?
I would imagine if I were one of the hostages, I would get to the telephone first, Peter.
Once again, tonight's top stories. President Reagan has taken office. The former hostages are free. The day is not over. We'll have a report on the inaugural balls and the hostages tonight on Nightline. And we'll break into our regular programming at any time to tell you more about the return of the freed Americans. We expect the next development around 8 o'clock Eastern Time, when they should be landing in Algiers. But for now, that's our report on World News Tonight. For ABC News, good night.